joining us with what those political moves could really mean for Wall Street and consumers is Doug Elliott. He is a former investment banker himself and now a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. And Doug, you say that you are optimistic still that something will get done and that we will see actual useful legislation.
I am fairly optimistic. There's a lot of roller coaster ride going on here, but in fact, it's in the interests of many of the participants to get a bill out there, including, as was mentioned on just the previous segment, there's a lot of uncertainty hurting the big banks. Wall Street would be valuing them higher if we knew what the rules were going to be. So even the banks have an interest in getting some reasonable compromise this year.
Doug, let me ask you, because I was at an event a few weeks ago with some of the key players from the financials who are down in Washington. They're obviously very involved with the legislation. And one of them said that we need a robust bill. This was the guy from Goldman Sachs. And he said, you know, that failed reform is not good for the industry. Are we seeing a robust bill being formed in your view?
I do think so. I've been saying for some time, I think we'll get about 2/3 of the way to where we should be. But given our political system, that's a good outcome. And we needed to do a lot, so even getting 2/3 to the ultimate goal is a big movement.
When you talk about where we need to be, I mean, there are a couple of big pillars here, right? You've got the too big to fail issue, and you've got the consumer protection issue. Which is more important to the guys writing up this legislation?
Well, I think the most important thing is almost certain to happen because it could be done regulatorily as well, which is we need the whole system to have more capital than it had before. And one way of dealing with too big to fail is that the biggest banks have to have even more capital than the rest of the industry. So more capital for everybody, particularly more for them. Now, too big to fail is a particularly tough problem, and they're not going to solve it. But what they can do are some things to make it somewhat less likely that we'll have a big failure, to make it take longer before we get there and be less expensive when we do.
To make it a less attractive option to get bailed out.
Absolutely, though I will say there's a lot of overstatement about the attraction that Wall Street firms felt for being bailed out. If you were someone who worked at one of these firms or you were a shareholder, you didn't like the outcome at all.
Right.
It was the creditors who were too loose.
Well, let's go back to the Consumer Protection Agency, because the idea of putting it in the Fed, you know what critics say, well, the Fed missed a lot the first time around. How is this going to be the solution for protecting the consumer, the individual investor, retail investor going forward?
I don't think it's a great solution, but we did such a lousy job across the board. Having some agency with some central control, even if it's part of the Fed, is better than where we were.
And dedicated to that chunk of the investment environment, if you will.
Exactly. I would like it to be an independent agency, as the administration proposed, because it's very hard to persuade safety and soundness regulators to make consumer protection a priority.
Let me break in here with a story that just really has come out over the past hour, and that is the Lehman Examiner saying that some other banks, including JPMorgan and Citi, have colorable responsibility or bear colorable responsibility for the failure of Lehman. I mean, is it brand new, fresh headlines? Surely you haven't heard this, but what does this mean to you here? Is it possible that the Lehman Examiner is just trying to blame other banks to try and get more for Lehman creditors?
Well, look, it would make sense. Basically, if you're in the position of being responsible in some sense for Lehman, either in the past or going forward, it makes sense to make the best case possible for how other participants played a role. And this has been such a complex crisis, you can find some blame attaching to almost everybody for almost anything.
Does that mean, do you also blame the government, I mean, ultimately for letting Lehman fail? I mean, they obviously came in and helped everybody else, but they didn't help Lehman.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think there was an argument for rescuing Bear, but there wasn't really an argument for rescuing Bear and not rescuing Lehman.
Right, right.
I mean, it's interesting that the Lehman examiners are going through this, and I'm just seeing the headlines come across here, saying that the transactions downplayed leverage, saying that they downplayed the balance sheet, the report describing off-balance sheet deals. I mean, it's possible, I'm sure, with such complex, and I mean, with your experience as an investment banker, you surely can understand such complex deals and so many deals that you could see tentacles spreading anywhere. I mean, this is the interconnectedness of the system that we're always talking about as the problem.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of these transactions were deliberately done to make companies look better to their key constituents. You're supposed to do it legally and in an ethical manner, but as long as you meet those characteristics, there's nothing wrong with doing a deal that makes people like you better.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because one headline saying Lehman transactions obscured financial condition in 2007 and 2008. clearly that's what you want to do to boost your stock price, to sell debt at a better price, etc.
Look, if you put makeup on, is that ethically wrong? It depends.
I feel wrong about it. Every day I feel wrong about it.